Welcome to the Expliker. Today, we're investigating one of the absolute most famous, widely repeated stories from the early Islamic Empire. It's always framed as this incredible tale of humility, leadership, and a dramatic transfer of power. But as we dig into the actual historical sources today, we're going to uncover a fascinating gap between the stories we tell and the history that was actually written down. So let's dive right in and separate fact from fiction. If you know your Islamic history, I can almost guarantee you've heard this vivid tale, probably since childhood. As the story goes, the Muslims had surrounded the holy city of Jerusalem. The city's leader was ready to surrender, but he had one highly specific condition. The supreme leader of the Muslims, Caliph Umar bin al-Khattab, had to travel all the way from Medina to accept the surrender in person. So Umar agrees. He sets off on this incredibly long, arduous journey, and he brings along just one slave and a single camel. Because the trip was so tough, they supposedly took turns. You know the story. They alternate riding the camel mile after mile, day after day, the whole way there. And then we get to the legendary climax of the whole thing. According to the tale, right as they reach the gates of Jerusalem, it just so happens to be the slave's turn to ride. So Umar, the literal ruler of a massive, rapidly expanding empire, enters the city completely on foot. He's holding the camel's rope, and his slave is sitting comfortably on the camel's back. The people of Jerusalem are supposedly so completely shocked and moved by this insane display of humility that they just immediately willingly surrender the city. It's a beautiful, super dramatic narrative. But guys, here is where we hit a massive historical roadblock. When we actually crack open the documented texts of early Islamic history, this story, it's just not there. It's entirely absent. It isn't in any hadith collections. It's nowhere in the foundational history books by renowned classical scholars like Tabari, Ibn al-Athir, Ibn Kathir, or Ibn Khaldun. Actually, for the first 1,200 years of the 1400-year history of Islam, this whole story of the alternating camel rides was virtually unheard of. It only really started spreading like wildfire in the last 100 or 200 years. So how on earth did that happen, and what actually took place? To figure out the reality, we've got to look at the actual documented timeline. After the axing of the first caliph, Abu Bakr, who had already kicked off campaigns against the Roman and Persian superpowers, Umar was appointed as the new caliph. Under his leadership, this expansion accelerated incredibly fast. And that brings us to a critical, heavily documented turning point that completely set the stage for the siege of Jerusalem. That turning point was the Battle of Yarmouk. This was arguably the most difficult and pivotal moment for the Muslims at that time. Picture this, a Muslim army of merely 30,000 going up against a colossal Roman force of 150,000. It's a massive mismatch. Yet thanks to the brilliant military strategy of their commander, Khalid bin Walid, the Muslims pulled off a decisive victory. They effectively devastated the Roman presence in the region, completely clearing the path forward. Literally right after this monumental victory at Yarmouk, the commanding general sends a letter back to Umar in Medina. He reports the huge win over the Romans and basically asks, okay, what are our orders now? Do we keep advancing, or do we pivot and target the holy city of Jerusalem? Umar's response was brief, and it was decisive. He pointed them directly toward Jerusalem. So the Muslim forces marched right on the city and surrounded it. Now, because Jerusalem had such immense religious significance, the Muslims really did not want to capture it through warfare and bloodshed. So their general sends a letter to Jerusalem's leader asking for a peaceful, bloodless surrender. The city's leader was actually agreeable to a peaceful handover, but he countered with a totally unique demand. He flat out stated he would only surrender the city if the caliph himself, Umar, traveled there to accept it in person. The generals relayed this totally unprecedented demand back to Medina. When Umar read it, he immediately called a meeting with the Sahaba, his closest companions and advisors, to figure out what to do. Most of them actually advised him against going. They argued that his presence just wasn't necessary and the army could secure the city without him. But one key figure saw it differently. Ali bin Abi Talib suggested that Omar absolutely should make the journey. Omar hugely respected Ali's counsel, took his advice, made Ali his deputy caliph back in Medina, and hit the road. Now, everything up to this exact moment is 100% historically verified and perfectly documented in the classical texts. But right here, right at Umar's departure from Medina, is where the popular myth totally splinters away from the documented facts. If we comb through the foundational classic texts by giants like Tabari and Ibn Kathir, there is absolute silence about a single camel being shared back and forth with a slave. The story just literally does not exist there. It is entirely a phenomenon of the modern era. And you don't just have to take my word for it. We can look at rigorous textual analysis from modern scholars who have actively hunted for the origin of this exact tale. Take the incredibly detailed history book Tariq-Muslima. It's written by a prominent Pakistani scholar and features an introduction by the highly respected Mufti Taqi Usmani. When this book finally reaches the chapter on Umar's journey to Jerusalem, the author tackles this famous camel story head-on. The author states clearly that despite exhaustive searching through the historical records, this event cannot be found, not even in the absolute weakest, least reliable traditions of Islamic history. The scholar actually makes a direct plea to the readers: stop spreading the story. Why? Because if anyone challenges you to provide proof for it, you will be totally unable to do so. The evidence simply does not exist. And the crucial thing here is that this realization isn't just coming from scholars in one specific region. Prominent Arab scholars totally agree. For example, Ali as-Salabi, in his massive, comprehensive biography of Umar, completely leaves out this fictional camel story. Furthermore, if you look at modern, highly authenticated media, like the critically acclaimed Umar series, which is widely considered the most historically rigorous dramatization of his life, that whole dramatic sequence at the gates of Jerusalem, it's nowhere to be found. Okay, so if the whole alternating camel ride thing is a modern myth, what is the verified, historically documented sequence of events? Let's reconstruct the true story, relying strictly on the classical texts. According to the actual records, Umar didn't travel directly from Medina to the gates of Jerusalem in one long, isolated trek anyway. Instead, his first stop was Jabia, which was acting as the primary headquarters for the Muslim forces at the time. Umar arrived there, spent a few days conferring with his commanders, and only after all of that did he proceed toward Jerusalem with his companions. It's during this final, shorter leg of the journey that history records a very specific, totally authentic incident. Umar had to cross a canal, and while doing so, his simple, everyday clothes got stained with mud. When he finally met up with the Muslim army stationed outside Jerusalem, his commanders noticed his humble, muddy appearance. Wanting their leader to look the part of a massive empire's ruler, they actually advised him to change into some really expensive garments and ride a majestic horse into the city. They figured that projecting wealth and power would impress the locals. And honestly, his response to this brilliantly illustrates the true character of Umar, way better than any fabricated myth ever could. He completely rejected their advice to dress up. Instead, he delivered this profound statement. He told them that the honor they possessed in the world didn't come from fancy clothes or outward displays of wealth. It came exclusively from Islam. He chose to remain exactly as he was, humble, completely authentic, and totally unbothered by worldly perceptions. Following that interaction, Umar just proceeded right into Jerusalem. He rode on his own camel, wearing his simple, mud-stained clothes. There was absolutely no theatrical scene of him holding a rope while a slave rode. Plus, the Muslim army was already encamped right outside the city anyway, so they weren't exactly finishing up a grueling desert trek at that specific moment. He just simply rode in. And exactly as the Muslim forces had hoped, and as history very reliably documents, the peaceful, totally bloodless surrender of Palestine and the holy city of Jerusalem was successfully secured by Caliph Omar. The reality of what happened, his deep reliance on faith over outward prestige, and his strict commitment to a peaceful transition, is incredibly powerful entirely on its own. It really doesn't need any historical embellishment to be amazing. The historians who debunked this myth draw a really interesting direct line back to a timeless Quranic principle. The principle is, when news or information comes to you, you must research it thoroughly before accepting or acting on it. The fact that a completely unverified story could become universally accepted as absolute truth over just the last century is a pretty stark reminder of why this rule of verification is so absolutely crucial. Which leaves us with a pretty critical thought for our world today. I mean, if a historical myth could spread that thoroughly way before the invention of the internet, just imagine the risks right now. In our current age of artificial intelligence, viral social media rumors, and instant communication, we are constantly bombarded with stories. It really begs the question, how many other narratives are we blindly accepting today without ever asking for the sources? Thank you for joining this Explicker, and remember, always verify the history you hear.